Ay, yo lo único que le pido a Dios es que nos dé salud cuando lleguemos a viejos.
Say hello, America. We are part of the new U.S.A.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Qué Pasa podcast, our watch-along podcast for Qué Pasa U.S.A., leading up to the 50th anniversary of the airing of the first episode of it back in April of 1977. So we are going to be doing this once a week, pretty much every week from the time that we started, all the way up until April of 2027. I am Dani Mendoza, and we are here to talk about episode 2, Ay Abuela. I say we because I'm here with my mom.
Mimi Belt, hi. And yes, Ay Abuela. So definitely this being the second episode in this then nascent series, it is very much focused and centered on the character of Adela, the abuela and the family.
Adela, viejita, abre la puerta.
Te prohíbo que me vuelvas a llamar viejita.
With a subject that is very core to the Latin culture as a whole, certainly the Cuban culture, and that is what happens to folks as they age, particularly in your family, and the fear, the very real fear in Cuban families and in Latin families in general of being put away in a home. Probably even more so, more ingrained in the culture is this notion that the children of folks who are aging feel a tremendous responsibility.
Put someone of my family in a home. Never.
So that is the subject of Ay Abuela. At the core of it as well is Adela's fear that she's not useful to her family anymore, or that she's maybe not with it, or not modern enough for some members of her family, that she feels she's a nuisance. Her grandchildren do make her feel intentionally or unintentionally to be a nuisance because of the things she says and does. Particularly, she is much more opinionated and strong as a character than her husband, Antonio. And she takes her matriarchal role in the family very seriously. So she kind of gets in the way of her grandchildren.
En Cuba, Juanita jamás se fue para el colegio sin llevar un suéter metido en la maleta, ¿eh?
I don't care if you took sweaters to my mother in Cuba, but we're not in Cuba, and I am not my mother, okay?
Then there is the inevitable comedy of errors that results from not understanding the language and not speaking English, where she overhears a conversation and mistakes it for a conversation about putting her in a nursing home. So that in a nutshell is the episode. And then, as is the format of this podcast, we each take a moment or a part of this episode, deconstruct it, and talk about it from our perspective. So I guess I'll start us off, and that is because, again, although it's the overarching theme, I think it's really interesting to kind of explore the moment that Adela pokes her head back in the door after she's had one of many fights with her grandchildren over the course of the episode, and has left the house actually just wearing her slip and her blazer to go to church, pokes her head back in the door and hears them, the tail end of a conversation where they've been talking about maybe we should get her some rose bushes to keep her busy and keep her happy, and only hears them say, tomorrow we take her to a nursery.
Tomorrow we take Adela to a nursery.
Magnífico. Mañana por la mañana llevamos a mamá a un nursery.
In her mind, a nursery is not a place where plants live. It is a place where old people are put away. She mistakes it for a nursing home. So that is toward the tail end of the episode, but it really is where the conflict culminates and is the moment for me that is at the core of what is a big no-no in our culture, and that is to have your elderly live somewhere other than in your home. With that, I don't know, Danny, what your takeaway was from the episode, if it was different or the same as mine.
Well, I think to that point first, before we go into what I wanted to highlight as a separate moment that we could talk about independently and then, in combination with the one that you brought up, that moment that I think it was Joe brought up, that it's a bit of a, didn't use this language, but it's a bit of a privilege to be able to do that not everybody can afford to do it, right? Not everybody has somebody at home, was what was cited specifically, to be with older folks, implying that unlike Adela and Antonio, who were very physically mobile, not everybody is equally self-sufficient. And especially for a story that centers a, let's say, lower middle class family in Little Havana, a working class family in Little Havana in the 1970s.
Es que yo no sé cómo hay gente que ponen a sus viejos en un home de esos.
Mami, no lo hacen porque quieren. It's just that sometimes there's no one left at home to take care of the old folks.
Part of what they benefited from was the multi-generational nature of the family, split a lot of the domestic labor across the generations. That's how the episode ends, is with the grandchildren telling their grandmother to relax and then instantly coming back with, hey, can you fix this for me? Hey, can you fix this for me? And then coming out like, oh, we give you a kiss and a hug. Ha, we love you. But you know what? They really do want her to fix it, right? So like it's definitely, she's definitely useful. And they're not just doing it to make her feel useful, but the reality is she is useful in a lot of different ways. The kids were, particularly Carmencita, very immature in this episode by design, right? That was the point of it. And Carmencita was downright cruel.
She's always in the way and making my life miserable.
In that situation, it was wonderful to see from an anti-ageist perspective what was a depiction of an incredibly well put together, strong-willed, fully vibrant person in the person of this abuela, where to my mind it feels ridiculous, the idea that anybody would put her in a home, because she doesn't need it, right? She doesn't need the assistance. She just needed to be acknowledged. She needed to be connected with as a person. She needed to not be treated like a prop or an afterthought. It wasn't her who really needed to change, even though her misunderstanding drove a lot of the drama here. The truth is the family was not treating her the way that they should, even though they had her in the house. And one of the things that I find interesting about that is, so they're acting out of obligation to some degree, theoretically, so she thinks, right?
And I think that's really interesting because Adela and Antonio are Juana's parents. Right. And a lot of that sort of obligation, that sense of duty comes through when Juana says,
Put someone of my family in a home. Never.
And I think there's a lot of love in that statement as well. It's not all obligation. But what I found really cool about this was that the sense of obligation definitely was the undertone there when Juana said, I would never dream of putting my parents anywhere. Yet it is Pepe, not their son, who sits his children down and says, you need to be respectful to your grandmother.
Sea la última vez que te oigo gritarle a tu abuela.
Pero, papi.
¡Silencio! Yo quisiera saber lo que ustedes se creen. Older people you have to respect.
And I find that just lovely and brilliant because he is the one, and Juan and Pepe never get in the way of Adela. Do not mistreat her. It is her grandchildren who make her feel like she's in the way, to the extent that at one point they're laughing at her because she's listening to the radio, she's interrupting their studies, and they find the novelas she's listening to ridiculous, but then she starts to comment on things, and Carmen basically says, you know what, you're always in the way. And she says, yeah, I'm always in the way. I'm always a bother. Why don't I just pick up my things and go back to Cuba? And Carmen says, what's stopping you?
Ya sé que yo aquí siempre estaré fuera, estaré out. Por eso no quisiera otra cosa sino recoger todos mis matules y marcharme a Cubita linda.
¿Y quién te está aguantando?
That's really the detonator, to where really to the point that that's why Adela walks out into the world half dressed.
And Velia did an incredible job. I mean, such grounded performance. You know, it was really, because this is a very heightened show and deals with heavy topics, but typically in a very light way. And she really delivered a moving performance there.
Tienes mucha razón. No me está aguantando nada. Por eso me voy.
I felt her pain. I was hurt with her, you know, in hearing that. That's actually the moment that I want to dig into. But before we do that, I just want to finish up mentioning that the thing that about what you just brought up that I think is really important to highlight is this show isn't lazy, right? This show doesn't do the tired stereotype in a lot of sitcoms, predominantly not Latino sitcoms, but to some degree, as the years go on, you look at something like the George Lopez show and you get stuff like this, right? Very, very tired, I don't get along with my in-laws shtick, right? Pepe, not a trace of that in this episode, you know? Pepe was actually, there's a moment that sticks out to me where Velia comes out a little bit later in the episode. Spoilers here, but I would imagine spoilers for all of it. Please, if you're not aware of this, watch along the episode before you listen to these rather than afterwards, because we're talking about details of the show as we're going. But later on in the episode, Adela comes out with a wig on, looking much more moderna, wearing clothes that are much more modern. It's a callback to a joke earlier on where Barbara's grandmother was very like hip and with it and would drive on the highway all the time at 76, like going to like dance across town, and her friends, you know, Carmencita and Violeta, were impressed by it. So they're impressed by that, right? But then they don't treat, you know, Carmencita doesn't treat her own grandmother in the same way. Violeta doesn't seem to be nearly as cruel or spoiled as Carmencita, but does speak of her own grandmother as a nuisance later and talks about, oh, we got her a rose bush, so now she bothers the rose bush instead of me, which is funny and also sad, right? Because it's just a person who's like a real person who still has a lot to contribute to the world, who is talking to plants because the people in her house don't want them to talk to her, right? That's not great either. But yet they're really impressed with cool, Sharon's grandmother, who's Americana. And I think that's part of what this gets at, because the moment that I wanted to highlight was the moment that you just described, but before everything blows up, when she's just trying to listen to her stories. You know what I mean? She's just in the kitchen, Adela, trying to listen on the radio.
Ay, abuela, ¿cómo tú te empujas a esos dramones tan picudos?
Dramones, picos.
Carmen, take it easy. She likes her soap operas.
Pues quiero que sepa que la inmensa mayoría de las historias esas están sacadas de la vida real.
¡Ja! Pues real basura.
It's not her fault, the room that the radio's in. The kids can go study not at the kitchen table. They can go study in another room, right? She's listening where she can listen. It's one of the pleasures that she has in her life. It reminds her of things earlier on in her life. It reminds her of a place that she had to leave, that she will never get to see again, you know? And she also just enjoys the story. She enjoys romance, like hundreds of millions across the history of humanity. Billions of people enjoy romances, right? And yeah, silly little telenovela romances a lot of the time. There are a lot of reasons why people enjoy that do not need to be looked down on. And I think because these kids, particularly Carmencita, going through that pesadez of teenagehood that a lot of people go through, was also dealing with trying to figure out her identity. And I think this is what the story was getting at to some degree. And be like, I'm not like that. I'm not stuck in the past. I am not the things that maybe get hung on me at school that I associate with where my family comes from. So I'm going to reject this even more. And I'm going to reject my grandmother as the most prominent representation of that, because she is louder than Antonio, because she is even less Americanizada than, Carmencita's parents, right? It is that I found that was really compelling there, because thematically what I find this episode to be about more broadly, like specifically it is exactly about that ageism and that inner conflict. It was wonderful to have an episode really about the grandparents, that inner conflict of, well, what is it that you can contribute? And then finding a way to do that in a show that is ostensibly for and about teenagers. They had to make it the teenagers didn't get it, right? That's the way in, so the teenagers have a lesson to learn in the episode. All that's great. I still found it all the more powerful, and I think this is the secret sauce for the show in general, or more often than not. Through the comedy, they're exploring really profound questions of identity, especially as it relates to not just intergenerational family living, but to the immigrant experience. And I can't think of a better example of that in this episode than that exact conflict of her trying to connect up with these stories, and her granddaughter, instead of approaching with any kind of, forget about respect, what about curiosity? What about, what are you into about this? Why do you like it? No, calling it tacky, judging her for it, being incredibly rude about it. And Adela takes a while to get mad. She puts up with it while this little girl is talking over her damn show, right? Like, she is dealing with it in this shared space in the way that a person deals with things when they've had to deal with them their whole lives.
Yeah, and actually, that comes on the heels of a series of things that happened right before that radio show. That she really, you're right, she stuck with this for a while before she lost it, because prior to that, Carmen's ripping her apart about what she's wearing, and she says, well, I want you to know that back in Cuba, a woman my age would be dressed in very dark colors, meaning, look at me, I'm at least wearing brightly colored florals, and Carmen takes it the totally wrong way.
En Cuba, ya yo a estos años estaría vestida siempre de oscuro.
Huh. Well, maybe in Cuba you'd be in style, pero aquí estás fuera, out of it.
She's not even listening to what she's saying and doubling down. And Adela takes it and takes it and takes it. I think, too, what you said in terms of, the cultural aspect of it, what added and compounded to the conflict in the kids' minds, and the kids wanting to be closer to people like Sharon's grandmother, who was more with the American culture and less departed from it, like Adela is this notion that both Adela and Antonio constantly repeat things are better in Cuba.
Mira, mi vida, en Cuba ni un pordiosero se atrevía a
I
salir a
don't
la calle.
care how they wore them in Cuba. Goncho, why couldn't you just leave them alone, huh?
We all know that feeling, because I grew up with that too. I don't remember Cuba. I was 2 years old like Joe when I left. And all my life I heard about how eggs tasted better in Cuba, the moon was brighter in Cuba, literally everything was better in Cuba. And you begin to unconsciously or even consciously reject those statements because you cannot relate directly to the experience that they had. And then it just becomes, oh, sure, everything was better in Cuba.
The irony of that, because I remember hearing about that more from you and your generation than directly from the people doing it, because my grandparents that did that to you all the time did it far less to me. I think by the time they reached me, y'all had pushed back so much that they were like, they were already out of practice with it, or like keeping it to themselves more, or they phrased it differently. But I'll tell you, the irony is they were probably right about some of that stuff.
Right.
I mean, some of it is rose-tinted glasses and that sense of loss and regret over a home that you can never return to and a time that you can never return to, which is more universally accessible than even just in the immigrant experience, because all of us can't return to a time before. None of us can return to our youth, right? But like within that, yeah, maybe there was less light pollution where they lived in Cuba and the moon actually was brighter. Maybe the eggs were better because they were locally sourced and not factory farmed. I don't know. Like there are real things in there that if the generations found a way to talk to each other more. There's this thing I talk about in the other stuff that I do for work called the penguin problem. It's me referencing a study in Scientific American that was a linguistic study where we put a bunch of people together to talk about what's a penguin. Everybody's like, I know what a penguin is. That's a penguin. Turned out they had a 12% overlap on average in how they defined what a penguin was, because language is imperfect, right? As much as it is an expression of human genius. And I think that's part of what this episode gets at on multiple levels. Intergenerationally, it gets at we're not hearing each other. We're talking past each other. If they could just calm down a second and actually hear each other, and not be so wrapped up in their own shit. And this is much more Carmencita than Adela, because Adela was trying. It's really Carmencita being so wrapped up in herself.
And Joe to some extent, too.
Joe to some extent, but honestly, in my mind, Carmencita was the villain of the episode, because Joe was more like randomly reckless, but still showed affection for his grandmother consistently. Even when he would complain about stuff, it had like a jokier tone, but she was really mean to her grandmother. One of my favorite moments of the episode was when her grandmother mocked her back to her face.
Abuela. Desagradecida.
Because it was just, there was so much build up to that it was so cathartic to be like, yeah, that's what you sound like. Do you like that? No? Okay, stop. Like that's...
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. No, and I think, we'll see over and over, because we think, well, why, did Adela put up with this? The obvious reason, because she loves her family. The other part of it is she's also trying to establish her value to the family. She gets to the point where she is even doubting.
Antonio tiene razón. Me estoy volviendo una vieja entrometida.
Am I useful to this family? And yet she's core to this family. And just her grandchildren in particular don't realize it, because I don't think there's a single moment that Pepe doesn't realize it. And I don't think there's really a moment in which Juana doesn't. But the kids are so wrapped up in, oh my God, my grandmother brought me a sweater to school. How embarrassing. Or, oh my God, she got in the way of this other thing. That they let those trivial things get in the way of the larger issue, which is we would depend on my grandmother to sew this button or to cook this meal or to do this for us, or what would we be doing?
And there is a real biological developmental cause for, to be fair, for Carmencita overreacting to the sweater thing, right?
Yeah.
Because that part of the episode, if any of you haven't watched this episode recently, is what kicks off the conflict with her grandmother, that she's mad that her grandmother brought her sweater to school. Her grandmother was just like, I always used to pack a sweater for your mom when she went to school, no matter what temperature it was, to make sure that she wouldn't catch cold, and I was worried about you. And she's like, you embarrassed me. That might actually be the part where Adela should have listened more, because the reality is she did embarrass her. It is a different cultural context. It's not okay. I would argue it's not actually about keeping Carmencita safe at all. It is about Adela feeling useful. That's Adela being insecure and letting that insecurity harm her granddaughter. Fair is fair, right? So I thank you for pointing that out. I do think that also speaks to something else that I think the politics of the creators would align with, and certainly I take away from it, which is that anybody, especially folks who are a bit older in age, but anybody should not feel, especially in their families, as though they are only worth what they can do for people.
Yeah.
Right? They should understand and be secure and trusting in the idea that if tomorrow they couldn't do anything, they would still be loved for who and how they are. Mm-hmm. And the people who love them would still want them to be there with them, would still want them to share the time with them, would still want to hear their stories, would want to help take care of them because they love them, because of who they are, not because of what they do. Because I do think she ends the episode still in a place where when the kids try to reassure her, the bueno, they're doing so by showing her she's useful by giving her stuff to do.
Well, it's also because, in a way, they kind of take it for granted that she's that person that does 100%. That. But I think what you say is absolutely true. But I think it also speaks to the fact that women, particularly of Adela's generation, were conditioned as young women, as girls, as little girls, to believe that their value is in what they do for others. Mm-hmm. So whereas Adela would take a sweater to her granddaughter, I remember stories of your dad, of my husband, and his grandmother, who he was very close to. She used to make a full-on meal. Forget that peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. She would make a full-on meal for him to take to school. Mm-hmm. And if he forgot it, she'd take it to him. And nobody, I think in that moment, it's such a strong urge to do right, to do what you're supposed to do, that you don't even realize it could be embarrassing for that kid.
Well,
right?
It's intergenerational trauma. That's what I mean when I refer to the insecurity, right? That's not even a criticism of her, because you're right, it's systemic. But it is intergenerational trauma because so many femme folks over the generations have been made to feel like, well, if I don't do things, then I'm worthless. Mm-hmm. If I can't take care of everybody, what good am I? Notice, Antonio didn't freak out about all of this. Antonio wasn't running around feeling like, and look, a retired person who worked out in the world all their lives has their own set of reasons to struggle with the same general sort of idea. But in this particular episode, Antonio seemed fine. Do you know what I mean? Antonio was okay.
Well, she actually lumps him into, in the police report, put him in there too.
Abuela. Mamá y abuela. Esta es la familia desagradecida que no me quiere. Arréstelos a todos. Ustedes son los culpables. Y ponga ahí también Antonio. And help.
The police is saying all the bad things that her family did.
As we're getting close to wrapping up, I do want to point out that was my other favorite joke alongside Adela mocking Carmencita, because seriously, I felt that in my soul, right? Yeah. I watched her do it and I was like, yes, Jamaica, shut up. This is not okay how you're treating your grandmother. But on top of that, when they had that nice little reversal, because comedy is so much about reversal so often, right? Of expectation. So you have the grandmother being brought back by the cops, and the expectation that is set up, as I understand it at the time, is, oh, it's because she was lost out there, or because, she needed help getting back or what have you, because it's a lot of what you see in those kinds of stories. It's not that at all. She's like, them, officer, go after them. They're the ones who hurt me. And then I gotta give a shout out in the 1970s for it being a black female officer, because that was obviously a deliberate casting decision.
Who spoke
on their
Spanish,
part.
by the way?
Who spoke Spanish well enough? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I don't think was supposed to be Latina.
No,
but
not at all.
made the effort to learn to speak that language, which I thought was a cool thing to throw in there, just as like a subtle aside for whoever picks it up and whoever doesn't, right? But to have this person in this position of authority who is also then standing up for somebody outside of their immediate culture, using their language to connect in that way, being very responsible, and then telling these strangers, like, what are you doing to your grandmother?
La tratan tan mal que tenía miedo regresar a su casa. La obligaron a ver una película de Cantinflas 5 veces.
What was Antonio doing? His wife was upset. People were disrespecting her.
And then
How
he's
is he
saying
not?
she's confused. She's not confused. She's pissed, and she's understandably pissed.
Yeah.
Like,
she's
no,
much
she's
more
not
attentive.
confused.
by design, she's much more attentive than he is, generally
Yeah.
speaking, right? He's much more, I'm relaxed. I don't want anybody to bother me. I'm going to read my newspaper. I throw out these little zingers, and then I go to sleep. You know, like that's his general vibe, at least at this point in the show, right?
Déjenla, muchachos, déjenla. Que cuando la abuela se pone cabezona, ni San Juan Bosco puede con ella.
But remember, it's never been on Antonio's shoulders to be the one to make the cafecito, make the dinner,
Yeah.
iron the clothes,
Yeah.
etc., etc.
Exactly. So he's allowed to relax, whereas she is made from a very young age, to your point, to feel as though there is a moral failing in her relaxing. And that is terrible and not what anybody deserves. And I'm glad that almost 50 years ago, they dug into this in this way. I think that there are things that they did in this episode that are more modern and progressive and forward thinking than when it comes to the intersectionality of all of this, right? Than a lot of shows have done self-consciously since, right? Honestly. There's a lot of great work out there done by a lot of great people who have gone further with this and done a better job. But I was really impressed with this episode in that context, how much they were able to achieve with that. And I have to imagine, you can tell me better than I can, because I barely knew Velia. She died when I was very, very young, and I wasn't around when the show was made. But knowing how good Velia was at her job, knowing how experienced she was, I mean, easily the most experienced person on the team, right? As I understand it.
Yes.
She
Triple threat.
Right. She and a strong personality. She respected the work of the writer tremendously. Everybody's job. I'm sure the same with the director and what have you. So I'm sure she wasn't out there just like changing lines willy-nilly. But it's hard for me to imagine that, especially given how young Luis was at the time, and I think he would say the same thing, that she didn't bring more dimensionality to what he wrote, or maybe he turned to her on some of that. Because how could he could look to the people in his life who know that, maybe talk to them about it, but it could not have possibly been a part of his lived experience then.
No. And I would guess that he would agree with that, because even in the conversations he had with you, Luis said on many occasions that at the table read, Velia would throw in lines or say, no, I wouldn't say it this way, or my mother wouldn't have said it this way. This is how. And so a lot of those idiomatic expressions, a lot of the zingers, in Adela's case came from Velia, in Antonio's case came from Luis. Okay, no, in the role of Antonio, he also added his own zingers, but Velia would do that quite a lot. And Luis Santero was a very generous head writer and would certainly welcome all that was true and genuine and fun and funny. And so he did welcome her contributions to it. So I think a lot of Velia and her insights are in this one in particular, but all throughout the series itself. So I know we're at time. And for my part, I will just throw in a fun fact here why this particular episode struck me after rewatching it after so long. All of the series is about intergenerational family and this family living together under one roof, which is not as common even in the Latino culture anymore. But I will say it rang true, especially true for me in terms of the fact that a family can live together in 3 generations, because that's what we're doing now. And that also came full circle for me. So I just wanted to say it was very personal in that sense, but it's definitely a great episode to watch, not only for all of its messages, but God, it's funny. It's really, really funny.
Well, and I'm married to a Pepe Peña in the sense that it was actually my wife's idea first for us to come and live together intergenerationally, which is really lucky that my parents and my wife get along so well. And obviously our daughter, I think I might have mentioned this already, but if I didn't, our daughter is very, very young. So a lot of the stuff that's depicted in the show is in some way ahead of us, right? But it was really important to us that our daughter have community in her life in a meaningful way, in a way that a lot of families in the context of modern living simply don't have, right? It's something that myself and my wife benefited from a lot. The presence of grandparents loomed large in our minds and in our lives for a long, long time. In my case, I was even lucky enough to have great-grandparents for a ton of my life, be a huge part of my life into my 20s. So that is a way of connecting up to one's history when you're not like Carmencita in this episode, that is irreplaceable, you know? There's a bond that grows out of that is unique to anything that you experience in life. And I can tell you, even just, you might even be able to hear in the background, we record this at home, folks. Even just my daughter, who's at the time of recording this about 17 months old, is already so much more herself because she gets to be around her grandparents as well as her parents all the time, right? And sees her other grandparents and sees other family as often as we can. There's just no replacement for that. When you have good relationships with family, not everybody does, not everybody needs to. I'm not a believer in family just getting a pass, right? Family's a verb, family's a choice, it's a decision we make every day. Family's who shows up, right? But I'm lucky enough that the people who I live with and the people who we see, more often than not, are the people who show up, not just for us, but now for our daughter, in the case of my mom, her granddaughter. And this episode is a great reminder of the need to find ways to actually reach each other. You are for sure hearing her, because I can hear her, and I don't know if our editor is going to be able to take that out. So we're going to jet to go help out with that. But we will see you in the third episode.
Watch Ay Abuela if you haven't already, and we will see you next time on Qué Pasa podcast. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa?